Okay, I'm gonna try to do another quick recording. I've been having trouble with these, but I'm hoping this one turns out a little bit better. So, what I want you guys to know by the end, with this reading, as I mentioned the other day, like a lot of times there's a number of people mentioned in the piece, but I really try to focus on the kind of core people, and in this case, it's Abigail Adams and Mary Wollstonecraft. So those are the two kind of primary figures, at least from the reading, to kind of pay attention to. Other than that, kind of to know a little bit about their context, what a woman's primary duty was at this time, why people would have objected to providing an education for women, and then somewhat of the sort of historical and social context. With this topic, I always like to mention that today we're seeing maybe another wave of somewhat feminist action in the United States. A lot of discussions around women's rights happening. This is from Women's March. This is Indianapolis a few years ago. And even though we're seeing positive things like an uptick now this year in the number of women elected to serve in Congress, there's still major gaps that exist, um, between men and women basically in political offices and in a number of different sort of locations. And we'll sort of come back to that a little bit, or that idea a little bit later. Around the world too, internationally is another issue I kind of like to come back to at the end. Saudi Arabia, for example, women getting the right to drive, but at the same time still facing a lot of obstacles kind of around the world. Right. With Abigail Adams and Mary Wollstonecraft, the author Barbara Solon says basically this is like she says the dawning of a feminist consciousness, and this is those two women are the women that almost all historians connect back to first wave feminism, the first real organized movement around or discussions that were emerging in society around women's rights and the position of women happened with these two figures. And both are directly connected to education. To give you an idea of the time period, women were incredibly vulnerable. They were basically the property of their husband, or sorry, the property of the father until they became the property of a husband. No right to own property, limited, if virtually no employment options. Um, if you harmed a woman, you were really committing a crime against the man who she belonged to. Women had, even in Abigail Adams mentions this, like the ability for women to travel even was limited. They had to be chaperoned by a man. So no divorce, things like that. So incredibly vulnerable. I sometimes give the example of this, like I ask students, if they could guess when spousal rape was outlawed in the United States. It was actually 1992 was the last state. Just to give you an idea of contextually of the kind of vulnerable position women were in. So if they were in a relationship with an abusive man, very limited options, and men were in sort of a I think kind of put into a role where they had sort of absolute power. So Abigail Adams was born into a middle class family. Um, she's known as one of the founding mothers of the United States. She was incredibly influential. As a young woman, she married John Adams, who went on to become, a leader of the Revolution and then later president. Abigail Adams, though, was incredibly influential in John's life, and I think a big part of it. And she was, for an example of that, is she was much better at business than he was when he was overseas in France as a diplomat. She ran the businesses far better than he did. She made a major profit. Um, she was an incredibly brilliant woman. She had a very keen sense as well of equality and rights. She stood up for African Americans. She took in a young African American boy in her community, offered him educational opportunities. She was opposed to slavery. She was an abolitionist, um, and so a sense of equality throughout her life. She wrote a tremendous amount in letters, but she didn't do a lot publicly. I think she always felt a little insecure because she never had a formal education. She kind of taught herself a number of different things, and then two received some tutoring and things like that through her family. In contextually, this is the American Revolution happens, the Constitution's happening, and Abigail Adams wants to carve out a place for women in this new society, and that's what she begs John Adams to do. To give you kind of a general theme of the reading that Barbara Solomon wants to illustrate, I think it's that women constantly tried to take advantages of the opportunities they had, but they continually bounced up against obstacles or limitations. And Anne Hutchinson's an example of that. She took advantage of, she was preaching, and a number of the women in the community were really taken by her and her ability as a speaker. But when men got wind of it and began to, try to kind of put her back in her place, she resisted, and then she was later excommunicated or banished from the community. Another example would be Jane Colden. Jane Colden was a woman. She was a botanist. She translated about 300 different, or categorized 300 new plant species in the United States, and cataloged them. She was trained by her father as a botanist. But when she gets married as a young woman, all of a sudden all of her work just stops. And what Solomon basically says, look, we don't know if she chose that or if it was forced on her, but we do know that a lot of women faced restraints in that time period. Right. Women were relegated to the private sphere. Men occupied both the public sphere and the private sphere. Women were relegated to the private sphere, but women too didn't have control over that. Men were in control in the private sphere. And the kind of compromise that happened with the new country and the new social structure after the revolution was that the idea was, well, women will contribute by providing citizens to the new community. So having babies, having children, being good domestic wives and mothers was how sort of the way that women were kind of, the perception of women or how they were conceived to contribute. So that became a woman's primary duty. And to give you an idea of this, like the one opportunity women would have had to do something would be as a midwife, because it was consistent with that idea of contributing women or contributing citizens. So this is the idea of Republican motherhood. Um, uh, this was sort of pushed in literature and in media in the stories of the time period that were popular. And there's some examples of that in the reading, like Pamela and Clarissa, and the one girl, is um, obedient and well behaved, and she goes on and she marries into the nobility. The other girl, challenges authority. She isn't, pure, and ends up dying, right, for what she does. The other idea that was promoted a lot in literature of the time period, and the reason people were so apprehensive about educating their daughters, is the fear that a man wouldn't want to marry an educated female. And that was kind of a real fear for a number of families at the time period, because you know a family would be responsible economically for a woman basically until she got married and the man began to provide for her. So that meant families were sort of nervous, about educating their daughters. Women were portrayed as domestic and submissive, pure, pious, domestic, submissive at the time period. All right. So one of the things I wanted you guys to do was really compare, contrast a little bit of Abigail Adams and Wollstonecraft. For their context or background, Abigail is in the United States. She lives through the Revolutionary War, and then the Constitution, and then the developing of the United States. Wollstonecraft was in England, but she eventually moves um, to France, and she gets caught up in the French Revolution and that same idea of kind of creating a new society. Adams advocated a full liberal education for women. She wanted women to have the same educational opportunities as men. She also wanted she advocated very clearly for protection for women, that women be protected so that they could travel and be somewhat um, autonomous or self-directed. But she stopped short of advocating real equality for women. She didn't really seem to foresee women being in politics or anything really outside that role of mother and wife. But she did advocate a full education for women. It's hard to know with Abigail. She did have a strong hand in writing the Declaration of Independence. It is, I think, agreed upon at this point that when they say all men created equal, they mean really humankind in the opening of the Declaration, and I see Abigail's sort of role in that. But at the same time, she was a first lady of the United States, and I think even today, like with Michelle Obama, who was an educated lawyer, a kind of breadwinner for the family, things like that. You tend to see even today, them in a kind of maternal role, and I think at that time period, it's hard to know really what Abigail thought about women's rights. Wollstonecraft, on the other hand, who was incredibly controversial at the time period, um, she died at an early age, in her 30s, after having given birth to her daughter. But she wrote a number of different books, and one of the most popular and influential was Vindication of the Rights of Women. And this is where she sort of lays out. It's a very detailed polemic, in favor of women's rights, and she wanted a co-education for women, a full educational opportunity, but public co-education, boys and girls um, educated together. She thought kids play together in a way and interact in a way that's different than adults, and that boys and girls needed to learn how to kind of interact and get along from an early age. She advocated full equality on par with men. She wanted women to occupy professions like lawyers, doctors, teachers. Um, so for and then she said women need political representation. They have to have people in the legislature representing their perspective. So it was full equality on par with men, in the public sphere for women. She claimed a woman's first duty was to themselves, that women needed to take care of themselves. Sort of like when the oxygen mask they tell you when you get on a plane to put it on you first. I think it's that idea of women when they cultivated themselves would be better wives and mothers. And she has great quotes. She says only when women have full equality will love acquire dignity. And I think kind of what she argues is that in marriage you can't really have a genuinely positive relationship when one person is in a childlike state of dependence and has no rights. When women were on par with men, then you could have an actual meaningful relationship in Wollstonecraft's view. Um, so this made her again incredibly controversial for the time period, obviously. Um, but I do like when they talk about Solomon talks about in the reading that we do know that the vindication of the rights of women was shared in the United States, that it was circulated, that women read it, they talked about it in their diaries. And she said it's one of those books that when people at least read it, they couldn't read it and go back to the way they had thought previously. Like it changed the way people thought about women and women's rights. And we know Abigail Adams read the Vindication. Her and John Adams sort of joke back and forth about it a little bit. Um, so that's generally Wollstonecraft. Um, she was also critical of women in the Vindication. She talks about um, how women sometimes play into some of the stereotypes that people have about them, and she wanted women, I think, to be more proactive in challenging things. She was One of her first books was actually on educating women, and around women's education. It was sort of more of a kind of how-to. She had worked as a teacher, um, opened up a school in London, um, and that was sort of some of her early influences. I think too she also had a kind of abusive father, so I think kind of saw the vulnerable situation women were in firsthand. Um, I think one of the interesting things, she was very influenced by Locke. So, for her, that idea that kids were influenced by their experiences and their environment didn't differentiate on sex. It was relevant to both boys and girls. And so she saw the what she said was that people see these flaws in women are actually flaws in the context and situation in which women find themselves. She also pointed out, in addition to Locke, like that people form associations and ideas from an early age, and from very early on, and that they're hard to get rid of. It's kind of like if you see a spider or something, or you're just creeped out automatically, or you know, all these associations begin to form early on. And so she talked about the influence that books and literature and media had on young women, and that was incredibly powerful in her mind. Those ways that people develop thinking about different people. She has great quotes. The Venetian is filled with great quotes. She uh, vehemently disagreed with Rousseau, who Rousseau saw the problems with women, or issues with women, as being part of their nature, that they were not rational creatures in his mind. And she attacks Rousseau quite thoroughly throughout the Vindication. I always like to kind of reference the Frankenstein. If you're familiar with some of the movies, or the original book was written by Mary Shelley, and in that original book, um, you see Victor Frankenstein as kind of the quintessential Enlightenment scientist, um, and really, in many ways, the book is kind of a genuine, like, somewhat of a feminist polemic. The one thing that Victor Frankenstein wants to do is take away women's only contribution at that time period, which is creating life or giving birth. Um, and then there's a lot too, just in the book, with his relationship with his mother, and then his desire for, or his bride, his fiance, and I think ultimately the folly of both the monster and the scientist. The reason they both end up being killed is their desire to control women, to see something women as somewhat of a possession, and things like that. But anyway, the connection here is that Mary Shelley was actually um, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. So that I think is where the influence comes from. And I haven't seen it yet, but there's a new movie out on Mary Shelley. So um, I think I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. This is from the movie. I've covered a number of these different issues already. But I do want to kind of mention these four areas, and that in the reading, each one of them, you can kind of see where they had somewhat of a positive influence with women, and then also, though, a drawback. So with the Enlightenment, we begin to see things like Locke and his advocacy for women to play a new role potentially in society. Then, of course, that wasn't subscribed into actual, changes for women. Women were still kind of relegated to second-class citizenship, had limited options, were very vulnerable, those kinds of things. Religion provided new religious doctrines that came out, sort of gave women at times a sense of community and the ability sometimes to network or interact with each other. What Solomon says in the quote that I wanted you guys to remember is that as an education, though, it was incomplete. Um, it didn't give women quite the sort of opportunities or options that they needed. Science, again, provided some new opportunities for women to contribute, then was also used to make claims like that women's, brain sizes were smaller, that women were inherently irrational, or those kinds of things. So it was, science too was sort of a double-edged sword. And then the Revolutionary War, as men went off to fight the war, women took over roles, in family businesses or running the home. They also contributed to the war effort. They organized boycotts. They monitored troop movements. Um, were decoys, did all these kind of different things to contribute to the war effort. And then just like though with World War II, once the war comes to an end, women kind of are relegated back into second class citizenship. So that too was sort of a double-edged sword. Um, so I think that's primarily the main points that I wanted to go over from the reading. I did want to mention one other example. In the reading, they mentioned New Jersey passed a law around voting that didn't differentiate by sex, that didn't exclude women, and they just forgot basically to do that. And so women took advantage of that to vote until they wrote a new law, um, forbidding women to vote. Basically, went back and changed the law. And if you're not familiar, women's suffrage came a significant period after men in the 1920s, and when you get the Seneca Falls movement and Katie Stanton and some of those others talking about women's rights and voting rights, they were carrying at that convention copies of the Vindication of the Rights of Women, and so you see its influence kind of um, carry on into later time periods. So, but that New Jersey example is again that point that Solomon's trying to make, that women took advantages of the opportunities they had, but constantly kind of bumped up against social constraints. We're not going to talk. What later in the semester we'll talk about Beecher, Catherine Beecher, and a little bit about women's seminaries and women's colleges that developed. Um, I just want to mention um, that I think still today, we have a lot of issues that we see manifesting in schools in different areas around, media representation, the way that women are represented in the media. Um, and this was a documentary, Misrepresentation, that does a pretty good job, I think, of pointing out some of the issues and how, too, the things like media representations today affect women trying to run for office or contributing in politics and those kinds of things. Um, and she came, the documentarian came and spoke at Ball State a few years ago. And then I also want to mention something of interest to me personally. Uh, um, the book referenced here is Half the Sky by Nick Kristof and Sheryl Wudunn, but I think what's led to a new movement or focus on women around the world is that there's a growing a major consensus now among like leading economists, people like the former president of Harvard, who's an economist, and others, that basically, if you wanted to move the world out of poverty, if you wanted to end global poverty and move the developing world into the developed world, the primary way to do that would be through women's empowerment, and particularly, in particular, like women's education. And there's still around the world today over 200 million young women who don't go to school or who don't have educational opportunity. And then I can tell you personally from work in Afghanistan and Pakistan that there's a major problem even with women who might go to a few years of maybe primary school, but the matriculation and development through school is limited, and that has a huge impact on society. And the research is pretty clear that when women get educated, they have children a little bit later in life. They have more manageable family sizes. They educate their own kids, and they go from basically consuming resources to contributing. And the book here does a pretty good job, I think, because it not only presents those statistics, but it also detailed the lives of young women, and it focuses on three different areas, kind of like economic empowerment, healthcare, and then education, and how those sort of are all interrelated. And then PBS did a documentary with actresses going and meeting some of these young women and talking about some of these different issues in different parts of the world. And you see in the documentary even some of the same things, like that idea that if a woman is educated, there was one scene where a family in Cambodia says they're worried about their daughter getting an education because a man won't want to marry her if she's educated. So some of those issues that still exist around the world, and it's been an issue that I've done research on and presented on in Pakistan and talked about in Pakistan, and a project that I was involved in Afghanistan was trying to raise female participation in higher education, um, show around 30%. It's now really low. Um, there's just a tremendous amount of barriers that prevent women. One of them, too, for example, is the travel. It's women, and so in a lot of those places, for example, women, they meet their husband on their wedding day. They have arranged marriages. They move in with the husband's family. They can't travel on their own. They don't have employment options. They're just in an incredibly vulnerable position. And when you're uneducated, when you're illiterate or semi-literate, you're just in an incredibly vulnerable position to defend yourself or speak up for yourself or advocate for yourself in any way. Um, so I kind of wanted to mention that contextual example, and I still think there are parts of Indiana that if you wanted to empower, to again to help eradicate poverty and change things, you would do that by empowering and supporting women because when you look at generational poverty and cyclical poverties, there are generally a lot of gender and women's issues incorporated sort of in those. So, all right, well, I hope this was kind of helpful or helped clarify some points from the reading, and I'll wrap up here. And in the future, if you guys have any questions, please email them to me. I'd be happy to try to answer those or incorporate those into these. So, all right, hope this helps.